Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Ann Sullivan, and along with Barb Lymans, I am the co-chair of the League of Women Voters of Illinois Mis and Disinformation Task Force. This is the fourth in a series of virtual education programs we're offering to help our local leagues and the general public stop the spread of disinformation. This program will be recorded and posted on our webpage, which is LWV Illinois. Oh, no, I'm sorry, LWVIL.org/misdis-info. I'm sorry, that's LWVIL.org misdis-info. And you can also find our previously recorded programs there, along with a growing library of resources that we'll be adding to as we approach the November 5th election. And now it is time for how to talk to people who disagree with you politically. I'm very pleased to introduce Gina Masullo, PhD, who is the Associate Director of the Center for Media Engagement and an Associate Professor in the School of Journalism and Media, both at the University of Texas at Austin. They are the author of Online Incivility and Public Debate, Nasty Talk, and the new Town Hall, Why We Engage Personally with Politicians. They are also the co-editor of Scandal in a Digital Age, a book that explores the way today's interconnected and digitized world, marked by social media oversharing and blurred lines between public and private spheres, shapes the nature and fallout of scandal in a frenzied media environment. Their latest book, Midlife Sapphic Revelation in the Digital Age, How Digital Media Support Coming Out Late, will be published in 2025. And they have spent 20 years as a newspaper journalist before becoming a professor. Their research focuses on how the digital space both divides people and brings them together, with a particular emphasis on political polarization. And I also meant to say that we have time set aside at the end for Q&A. And so if our attendees can place their questions in the chat, we'll be sorting those and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Gina.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that lovely introduction. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for being here and taking your time out to listen to this. And I'm going to just quickly share my screen and we will get going. All right, so you should be able to see my screen. Somebody holler at me if you can't. So what I'm going to be talking about, how to talk to people who disagree with you politically. I want to start out a little bit about why I even study this. And I will tell you, I study this because I'm not good at this naturally. I am not naturally that type of person who's really comfortable when it gets tense. I'm not somebody who is really great at choosing my words in the moment. I'm not good at any of this, which is part of the reason I wanted to study it, because I wanted to learn how to do this better. Hang on one second. All right, so I'm going to organize this around three main areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem, not because you don't know what the problem is, but because I think the problem ties into how we sort of manage it. And I also want to talk about why this is so important. And then we'll get to the real nuts and bolts, which is the research-backed solutions and things that you can do, practical things you can do. Okay, so the problem has multiple prongs. So number one, polarization is at really an all-time high in the United States, at least since we've been measuring it by political scientists. I mean, certainly during the Civil War, I think probably higher. But, since we've been measuring it, say, since the early 1900s. And effective polarization is this idea that you don't just disagree with someone who's not in your political party or who has different beliefs than you, is that you actually demonize the person. You see them as not valid. You see them as a bad person. And we're at that point right now. The majorities in both major parties, so both Democrats and Republicans, view members of the other party as more immoral, dishonest, and closed-minded than other Americans. And they also ascribe those positive attributes to their own party more than the out party. So what's important here is this feeds into the misinformation and disinformation that we're going to talk about in a minute. So again, the polarization feeds into the misinformation because it's being spread in multiple political camps. So that's part of it. But also when the two parties are so divided, there's no trust and there's no shared information. And that's exactly what's happening now, right? We're having this flood of misinformation, much of it on social media, going to get even worse as AI gets perfected and deep fakes get perfected. Deep fakes being, where they can like take my head and put it on somebody else's body, or even create a fake person who looks just like the real person. So that's going to even expand this. Misinformation already has led to violence, death, a lot of other problems. It has lasting effects on political economics of our country and other countries, because our country obviously has an effect on those countries. And targeted propaganda is also on the increase. And that is, information that is targeted to particular groups or communities. But then there's also just general disinformation, which is information that's not true, that's deliberately spread to confuse people. And that's different from misinformation, where people are spreading something they think is true, even if it's not. But both of those problems are on the rise. And then there's a third prong that connects to this, which is trust in mainstream media is plummeting. And it has been going down since the 1920s, and it is really plummeting now. And that's a challenge because it gives people no resource to turn to. Trust is certainly much higher among Democrats than Republicans, but that causes further divides because people are seeing completely different news information or trusting sites that maybe aren't trustworthy. But across both parties, a majority of Americans believe errors in news reports are done on purpose as part of an agenda. So this is a problem of the whole country, that they don't believe news, and that cuts down on where they can actually get accurate information, or how to even convince someone or persuade someone of something that's true because they don't believe the source material. Okay, so all this leads to this divided information streams that we have today, where Democrats and Republicans see completely different social media feeds based on what they click on. So they're tailored to their interests. They're seeing different news sites. They're consuming different news. And so then each side is immersed in their own point of view, echo chambers, and not having other views necessarily come in. On top of that, there's sort of this suspicion of authority, and suspicion of people in authority. We saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still, kind of going on, but still at the height of it, right? We saw where people didn't trust, top medical experts for the United States, or even, the World Health Organization. And that's a global phenomenon, this lack of trust in authorities. Also just leads to a lot of confusion, and people check out and they get apathetic and they don't want to get involved. And all those things in that middle box make people more susceptible to both misinformation, disinformation, anything that's false, because they don't have anchors to tell them what isn't. Okay, so that leads to the divisiveness we have now. This is important. And like I said, it's not that I don't think you all think it's important. I know you do, but it's important to talk about why it's important, because it links so much to the solutions. So talking across difference is the phrase I use when we're talking to people who disagree with us. And, I'm framing this much on politics, but it could be any topic, right? It could be disagreements about anything. These same principles really work. Why is this important in politics in particular? Because it might decrease the polarization we're having, which is really at an apex. And that polarization causes problems, infighting among the populace, but it also has our government at a stalemate. Increase understanding. Even if you don't agree with someone else, understanding their point of view can help you respect them as a person, maybe see how they got to that. It can lead to better decision making. If people are working together, even if they have differences in agreement over something big like politics, that's probably going to be beneficial in most groups. And to be honest, even if it wasn't the important to do, we have no choice, right? We are going to run into people who disagree with us on multiple axes, and that's just part of living in a society the way we do today. And online, that's obviously so much more amplified, right? Because online, we are communicating with people all over the world. Now, I do want to point out before we get into, how to do this better, I do want to point out the drawbacks, right? Talking to people who disagree with you about something like politics, even if you do it absolutely perfectly, even if you follow every single tip I give you or anyone gives you, some people are still going to get mad at you. And people's emotions intensify online because they're de-individuated. So people can't as easily trace what they're doing to them, right? They feel anonymous, even if their real name is known, because the internet's such a big place. And it can actually make people more polarized, right? When you say, well, this is what I believe, it can make them entrench. And it can make you a target of attack. So I don't want to lessen any of those things. All those things are real and happen. And I'll talk a little bit towards the end about that. Okay, so as I said, these are solutions that come from the Center for Media Engagement, where I work, as well as other scholars who work in the same space as us. And I'm going to divide this into 4 steps. So the first one is sort of getting ready to do this. And I think I have found this is good for any type of difficult conversation. Anytime you're going to have a difficult conversation, to do these steps. And then I'm going to talk about what kind of messages we have tested on social media that are more conducive to quality discourse across difference. So quality discourse in this case, meaning, people are having a robust discussion. They're not just, lying to each other. They're actually discussing an issue, but they're doing it in a way that's productive, right? It might lead to some good outcome. It's not screaming and yelling. It's not swearing at them. It's not name calling. And then also some tips, like I said, part of my expertise is on online incivility. So I want to talk a little bit about, what to do if inevitably somebody does get upset with you, which happens, and kind of when to click away. So the preparing, and like I said, don't skip this because it's easy. I do that too. I'm like, oh, I don't need this. I'm good at this, but it actually really helps. I read an amazing study when I was in grad school that I have not forgotten. And what they found is if you do the Superman pose, it actually increases the testosterone in your blood a statistically significant measurable amount. And what it's doing, it's boosting your confidence when your testosterone goes up. And this is true for men or women, non-binary people. It goes up, and it goes up because you're making yourself bigger by doing that. I do this before I have a job interview or anything. It really does work. And even if it doesn't, now that I've told you it works, it will work for you, because that's how the placebo effect works. The other thing is give yourself what's called a self-compassion pep talk. Self-compassion is a concept out of psychology, which is about sort of the idea of compassion, but applying it to yourself. Most of us are more kind, or often we're kinder to other people than we are to ourselves, right? And so self-compassion is like turning that inward and saying, well, how can I be kinder to myself? So what I'm talking about with the self-compassion pep talk is we have found one aspect of self-compassion is particularly important, which is the sense of common humanity. And that is this idea that we all have similar problems and experience the problems in life in at least some connected way and some empathetic way. And what we found in an experimental study was that when you expose people to memes like the one I have on the screen, which is stressing this idea of common humanity, you do that. We showed them 6 memes, and those people were more compassionate and receptive toward their outgroup than the people who didn't see these memes. And this was just 6 memes. So what I do now is I just flip through Instagram, and I follow a lot of Instagram accounts that have this inspirational stuff on them. And then I'm ready to go. And it just revs me up. Okay. What to say, right? This is the really, really hard part. We have found, unsurprisingly, being humble works better. But what do we mean by humility? Because I don't mean that you're going to let somebody say something that's not true to you, or somehow insult you. You don't want to be a doormat. That's not what be humble means. But what it means is really asking questions and talking to people with a real genuine openness for understanding their perspective, right? And you express things in terms of possibilities instead of certainties. So what that means is, well, this might happen if this were to happen, instead of this is going to happen if you vote for that person, right? Because people tend to shoot, kind of turn you off when you're too dogmatic, or it feels like it could be an exaggeration, right? And also acknowledge the limitations of your view, right? Your point of view isn't perfect, and your way of seeing things isn't perfect. The other thing, don't try to persuade people. And this is a very hard thing for most people to do, because whenever I talk about talking online, and I'm a big advocate for having conversations online, people say, well, why would you ever want to do that? It's such a cesspool. But I've had some really good conversations online. It's just, you have to pick the space that you converse in, and you have to, follow the tips in this. But one of the biggest ones is not trying to persuade people and coming in with that mindset. Because even if you say to yourself, oh, I'm not going to try to persuade them, often we can slip into trying to persuade them because we're like, how can this person not understand this? Like, how can they not get it, right? I just need to get them to get it, but they're never going to get it, right? And the point about talking across differences online is really to just understand. Like, persuading people is almost impossible with an online conversation. It's, and I'm not saying it could never happen, but if you go into it sort of with the idea, I'm just going to explain my point of view and really listen to their point of view, that's when you actually might persuade somebody, because they're open to you. The other point of this is to be an advocate for your viewpoint versus, sort of saying what's wrong with the other side, right? Here's why I believe what I believe is much easier to take than here's why what you believe is flawed, right? And you're saying the same thing, but you're saying it in a different way. Okay. The other thing is, and we've tested this on Reddit, where we had people, we randomly assigned them to join these parenting groups. And in one group, we would have, they would just talk about parenting like normal. And the other group, we'd introduce politics to it. And we would introduce politics at both ends. We had people we hired to work as, like discussion leaders, and they would go in, some were from the left, some were from the right. And one of the things we found about this was that there is some value to bonding over something that isn't about the key topic before you launch into the key topic, right? It doesn't mean it's going to make the conversation necessarily easier, but it's sort of like, what I always say, like when you step into an elevator, you don't say to somebody, well, I really want you to, well, what is your opinion on abortion? You don't say something like that. You ask, gee, nice weather we're having, or something like that. And I think you have to think of it like that online too, right? You need to build up that relationship kind of, I mean, and relationship in quotes here, because we're talking about like seconds, not days. But part of that is sort of building it so that the first thing you say to somebody isn't a question that's more difficult. And asking questions in a way that you're trying to understand rather than make declarative statements. And what I mean by that is, rhetorical questions are just that, right? They're really statements, they're not questions. And people do that a lot online, and it gets people revved up because, it's hard to do. Because it feels like you're being questioned, even if the person can be like, well, no, I was just asking a question. Well, no, you were telling a statement in the form of a question. And the other thing that we found worked is that if you kind of highlight something that maybe they said in a previous comment that you share, like they mentioned, I don't know, having a cockapoo dog, oh, I like cockapoo dogs too, and then get to the point. That's one way to do it. And the other way to focus on shared beliefs is to point out what you agree on first, right? It seems like we agree on boom, boom, boom. It seems where we don't match up is on this. Can you explain to me more about why you believe what you believe? And that's what we mean by the focus on shared beliefs. One of the things we found over and over again in doing interviews with people is that a lot of times other people will assume people have a belief because they're in a particular party, or because they live in a particular state, or they are from a particular city. And those assumptions can be really a problem because it focuses too much on the partisanship and not the people. There is lots of people who belong to a political party who don't believe half the things that party believes, or even know half the things that party believes. I mean, a lot of Americans, unfortunately, aren't, as you guys know, because, you're, promoting registering to vote. Obviously, a lot of people aren't even registered to vote. So it's, whenever you can, think of it as human beings, not as members of parties, because then it's easier to be kind to an individual than it is to an abstraction, right? Oh, there's just another bunch of that over there. It's easier for people to be maybe choose their words less carefully, not think as thoughtfully, right? Whereas an individual person, you want to be more careful. Don't take what anybody says personally. Obviously, that is a life goal for everything, not achieved by me, certainly, but always a good goal in this and in every other endeavor. But also share your own experiences, right? Vulnerability breeds vulnerability. I mean, nothing super personal, but relevant hypotheticals are actually more compelling to people than statistics. And that pains me as a professor who teaches statistics, but people will believe the anecdote, like, this happened to my brother-in-law, and they'll be like, oh my gosh, that is much more compelling to people than this has killed X number of people. I don't know why that is, but it seems like a number to people and they dismiss it. And the other thing is, and it's always tempting to talk about the worst case scenario, right? Because when you're talking about something, right, you're worried about the worst case scenario, but that's also the least likely scenario, right? And it makes things more divided and escalating really quickly. Okay. Watch your language. And I don't mean, I do mean profanity and hate speech, but I'm going to assume that we weren't going to, lace it all with hate speech, right? But when you're talking to people who you suspect have different beliefs than you, even if you're trying to correct something that's false that they believed, you have to be particularly careful here, because nobody likes to be corrected and nobody likes to find out they were wrong, right? So avoid loaded language. I mean, obvious ones, gun lovers, snowflakes, but even in misinformation, there can be language. We did an experiment recently where we tested if you did a fact check, and this was a broadcast news fact check, where the journalist would sort of treat the misinformation as something, hey, a lot of people believe this, but this is how we figured out that it was not true. Versus a more traditional fact check where they're like, this is just wrong. And we worried that maybe people felt shamed by that. What we found is both worked equally well, but this kinder, gentler approach, as I call it, is sort of what we're talking about here is people are just going to be more amenable to it if you avoid these sweeping always never type statements, right? This always happens or never happens are always a problem. And the same thing, like I said, with this kinder, gentler approach to fact checks, while it worked as well as a traditional fact check, we found other benefits for it, right? Is that people felt more connected to the other people. And so that could be a positive thing, that if you were in a situation where you had to explain some information that was not true, that maybe somebody already believes, backing into it a little. I mean, you want to come right out and say it, but you can back into it and be like, yes, this is very confusing, or maybe this is, a lot of people also believe this, so people don't feel, like they're an idiot for believing something that wasn't true. And this last tip, use connective language. You guys are the first ones to find out about these findings because these are not even published yet. We've just submitted it. So don't tell anyone. But we found, I'm just kidding about that. You can tell people. But we found this new idea of what's called connective language. And what this is language that helps people have a conversation where they disagree with the person without it escalating. And so what we've done with this is we've identified this in content, and now our next step is to actually test it out. But basically, the way this works is if you're talking to someone who doesn't agree with you, I statements are helpful, right? But validating the other person's point of view becomes very important, even if you don't agree with them. And there's ways to do that because that can be tricky, right? You don't want to validate the thing that's wrong or the thing that they're misinformed about, right? But there's other ways to do it, right? I appreciate your feedback is pretty vague. I appreciate your point of view. In my opinion, my 2 cents, it sort of shifts it to you. But obviously, if it's something that's, just bona fide fact, you don't want to make it like your own opinion. But this type of connective language, and we are still testing this out, what we think it's going to do is be the kind of, we've identified it and we want to test whether it really leads to less sort of escalation when people are talking across difference. But honestly, it's probably a good thing to do even if it doesn't, because it's a good way to talk to people. Speak from your own experience. People respond better to people. They don't respond as well to brands. So one of my colleagues did a study maybe about 7 or 8 years ago where they had a news site had a person comment, they were responding to comments on their newspaper stories. And they had someone respond as the journalist, like with the avatar of their actual face. And then they had someone else respond with just the avatar of their brand. So the name of the news site. And what they found was when the actual person was in there, people were more respectful and had better conversations than when the avatar was in there, even though obviously the same person was behind both. And what we think is people treat people, most people are polite. Even most people on the internet are polite. But when you see a brand, you're like, oh, well, that's not a person. I can just be a jerk to them, which seems crazy, but this study kind of showed that. So it becomes really important to speak as you, so with your own picture and your own avatar, not something fake or a sunset or something like that. And then basic psychology would tell you, use I statements, not you statements. I feel this, not you make me feel that. And explain why, like why this belief is important to you. Like I said, anecdotes are more powerful than statistics, and that makes me cringe, but it's true. Study after study shows it, sadly. And be specific and intentional about it. Like, it takes a lot of work to talk to people who you don't agree with. And that's why we're going to get to this part. What to do if people react. I should probably change that to when people react, because if you spend any amount of time online, you will get people upset with you, even if you say the most innocuous thing. Mild reactions, and by mild, what I mean is no hate speech, you don't feel threatened, no death threats, nothing like that. Any of that, things happen, you just don't talk to the person. Mild reactions is somebody's just being a little snotty, maybe. We've tested this thing called high person-centered language, and this also borrows from psychology. What this is a way to correct somebody while retaining their dignity. And I don't mean for you to be correcting the other person, but the principles of it can be applied to sort of any language situation. I call it therapist speak, because it's kind of, if you've ever been to therapy, it's like the way therapists talk to you. It just feels so nice, which is why going to therapy feels so good. Because instead of saying, oh, that's just not true, they'll say, I can see how you might believe that, but can I talk to you about why that isn't true, right? Which is so much easier to handle than that's just not true, right? And it will really shock people when you do it online. We tested this on an online experiment, and it was amazing how well it did. Like, it worked so well that we were almost like, wow, why don't we do this in everyday life? Asking questions that fit into this. Can you help me understand why you feel that way? Can you help me understand how you got to this belief? Are useful. When to click away, as I said, if you feel such a strong emotional response, you think you might lose control, yeah, it's not worth it. If you feel attacked, you don't have to prove whether you're attacked. You might feel attacked more quickly than I feel attacked. If you feel attacked, you shouldn't be in the conversation. Threats of death, rape, etc., anything sexist, racist, xenophobic, homophobic, I mean, I would cut things off at that point, because you're just never going to have a conversation with anybody that's useful. One other final thing I wanted to say, because I give talks a lot about talking across difference, and I'm a huge fan of it. But I also believe that if you are a member of any minoritized group, so I'm talking about Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer people, people who are disabled, people who have certain diseases, all of that, any group that doesn't fit the norm, you're always more at risk, because people feel more free to attack you. They're bigger targets, and they get more hate crime. I mean, hate crime across these groups is much, much higher than hate crime against groups that don't fall into these categories. And I just always think it's important to say that at any point, you should always leave a conversation if you feel uncomfortable or at risk. And the final thing I will say before we start opening to questions is, it is hard to talk to people who are different from you. It just is. It's like I said, I started studying this because I'm not particularly good at it, and I have learned a lot, and it takes a lot of work, but you also have to give yourself breaks. Like, you cannot just be doing that all the time, and you need to let yourself sort of like, sometimes I just need to be around people who are really just like me, because I need that safety. And now I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to your questions. And I think I hand it over to Barb.
Hi, Gina. Thanks so much. We do have a lot of questions. And one of the things that people are asking is, Judy asked in particular, do you find these tactics effective also in person as well as online?
They are. In fact, most of these, we tested them online because I study social media. But all these ideas for these all come from psychology research that did it face to face. And we were like, hey, would this work online? Guess what? It does. Yeah. So yeah, you can do them in your everyday life too. You might have to do them a little differently, right? Like some things would need to be a little different, right? Because it's a different framework online, right? Because you have facial expressions, right? So if I was talking about the non-face-to-face world, I would say, you need to look at your face in a mirror when you're talking to someone sometime, like even a friend, because like I know I have these micro expressions that aren't a poker face, and I'm not good at that. So it's like you have to manage your face more, I think.
So, so you would have to be more aware of your body
I
expression.
think your body language, right? Because we communicate so much with that, right? Facial expression, tone of voice, right? Online, there's really no tone of voice unless you go all caps. But in face to face, our tone of voice keeps going, intensifying as we get agitated, even without intent. So,
Carol asks that her brother lives in Florida and he's an avid Fox News follower, and thinks many things are fakes and a hoax. And the only thing that they seem to be able to talk about is weather or gardening. How would be a good way to start a meaningful conversation? I think a lot of us are in the same boat as we approach holidays.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I get invited to give this talk every year right before Thanksgiving in both the US and Canada. They have the same problem. What I would say to that is, especially since it's a family member, so that you want to have this conversation, because that's my first tip is choose whether you really want to. There's some people you just may never want to have that. But I certainly have family members who have very different views. And what works, if you have the stomach for it, is to really ask questions. Like, can you tell me where, I really want to understand, why you think that. And can you walk me through the process? I mean, what's hard about it is if the person already knows you disagree with them, they're going to think you might be being condescending. So I think it has to be couched within the relationship where it would have to be like, I wish we weren't, I think I'd say just what you said. I wish we could talk about more than just these two things. And I know I'm part of this problem, even if you don't think you are. And how do we get past this, right? And I do think asking questions, but it's not going to be an easy conversation. And I also say, like, that sometimes we just have to live with the limitation. I mean, I have relatives that, I have a brother-in-law that I just live with the limitation.
Yes, we probably are all in somewhat of the same boat. Kim was wondering, many women already use the connecting language before offering an opinion in a variety of settings. Is this connective language as effective regardless of perceived gender of the speaker or listener?
No, I think that's a good question. And the answer is we have not tested that yet, but we plan to. And I agree with you that some of it sounds a lot like hedging. And there's the feminist in me cringes because I'm like, well, I don't want to tell people to hedge. I want them to be strong and powerful. But it is different from hedging in the sense that it is the key part of it isn't to dismiss your own point of view. It's to be more open to the other person. But you're right that hedging, when people hedge and they don't really own an opinion, right, which is something women tend to do more. But I think it's a very interesting question. And, probably in a year, I'll know the answer to that.
Well, then we'll have to have you back. In your online experiments, can you tell us if anyone became more open to other views and how did that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the one experiment we did where people, I mean, we haven't done something where people are more open to a specific view. More what it's been is what we usually measure is a decrease in effective polarization. So we ask them a series of questions about their political outgroup. And then we use those as a measure of how they feel about the outgroup. So we haven't tested as like, can we give you this and make you more open to this issue? It's more like, can we show you this and make you more open to not hating the other party? Does that make sense? The
Yes.
difference between two.
Yes, yes. Susan wondered if there are safe places where to practice your tips. Do you know of any resources or safe places?
Yeah, I mean, Reddit does have a, I don't know if you're on Reddit, but Reddit is organized into subreddits, which are, mini sections. And they have a subreddit called Change My Mind, which the whole subreddit is trying to do this kind of thing. Like it tries to be very deliberative. People are, I mean, you can't practice it in the sense that it's like, it's still in the internet, but it's totally anonymous there. And everybody's doing that kind of thing. Like people will put forth a point of view and then other people will put forth another point of view, but the whole subreddit is about doing it in a really constructive way. So that's one place that you can both witness it, but you can also join in if you want without really facing anything, because it's a pretty safe space.
Julie was asking, what are the signs in a conversation that some incremental progress towards agreement has been achieved? Is it the party saying something like, I'll think about what you've been saying, you might have a point, and not an entire change in perspective? What should we look at for that we are reaching some sort of true conversation?
I mean, I think that I would make the bar even lower. I think if you're able to even have the exchange without the person shutting you down, I think that's a win, because you really don't know how much that person will think about it, right? Like they may not, when you're there, say, oh my God, that was a great point. You changed my mind. But they may think about it, right? And if they're like me, they'll think about it all night, overthink and overthink. And then who knows, in 2 weeks, you might have changed something and you might not know it. So I would see it as a win if the person even just doesn't say, I don't want to talk to you about that. I would see that as a win. And then, obviously, if they say it's something to think about, I think it depends on how they say that, because I think a lot of people will say that just to put you off too, right? Like, I mean, oh yeah, I'll think about it, but they're not really going to think about it. I would see it also as a win if they start asking you about why you believe what you believe, because then it's showing a true exchange, right? That it's not just, their belief is perfect, that they're actually interested in your belief.
So the basic thing is to make sure you're not only that you're doing some active listening. Is paraphrasing a good tool to have in our toolbox when we're speaking to
Yes,
people who
definitely. Like reflective listening, where you just, so what you mean is, right? And then it helps the person feel heard, but it also makes sure you do understand it. But yeah, that's always a great, right. And that again is borrowed. That's just borrowed from psychology too. And also therapists do that really well.
I think we're all realizing we have to become therapists as a sign. We do have a comment that says, I want to compliment Dr. Masullo, as I'm a 12-year plus nonpartisan elected official who has been heavily attacked the past 4 years. And these tactics do work. And I use connective language all the time. My question is, when people come in hot to argue with you because they have labeled you, is the best tactic to get them to take a step back, to tell them I want to listen to them and understand them? Or what tactic would you recommend when someone comes in hot?
Well, here's what I would say. And this is not from my research, but this is from other research, a lot of published research, is the number one thing you should not do is tell them to calm down. Telling people to calm down is the worst thing to do when people are excited, because then they see it as you're being chided. Another adult is chiding me. And I think that's actually a big problem, that politicians have done that to people, have said, I'm not going to talk to you till you calm down. You know what? You will just enrage a person. When someone is upset, what they want is to be listened to. And so, yeah, if someone's upset, I would say, tell me what you're upset about and let them yell. And don't correct their tone. Don't tone police them. Because you know what? If that person gets that out, they're going to calm down. I mean, if you feel personally at, like seriously, like you're going to be injured, obviously don't. But telling a person who's upset to calm down is like taking gasoline and throwing it on a fire. So what I would suggest, and what the research suggests is, yeah, ask them questions, really listen to them, because most people get angry and raise their voice at politicians because they don't feel heard. And it may not be the politician's fault that they aren't heard, right? It might not be their fault at all, but the person still feels unheard, right? And that's fundamentally the problem, regardless of how they feel.
So just taking this a little bit further, you're having a conversation with someone and you begin to feel they're not hearing you and you start to get hot.
Mm-hmm.
What should you do at that point to calm yourself down and to perhaps the other
I don't
person
know,
listen?
pop a Valium. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, you're totally right. Cause that's the challenge. Right. And, my only advice is to try to catch yourself and switch to, even if you have to walk away, it's probably better than you getting escalated yourself. Right. Even if you have to say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I have to go. And it'd be weird. That would be better. But I also think, the basic things, right? Stop talking. Stop explaining, right? Because the more we explain, the bigger, and I do this, I'm the worst offender, so I know this, right? Like you keep explaining and then it keeps escalating, right? Stop talking is number one. And take a lot of deep breaths and ask the person a question, so that forces you to not be able to talk because they're talking.
Oh, I think that's good advice, and that I have to indwell into me.
Mm-hmm.
I have a tendency to talk faster and louder.
Oh, I do too. I absolutely. Yep.
Maybe it's human nature that we.
Yeah. Well, and there was a comment in the chat that's really good. Have a list of calming statements handy so you can review and rehearse them. That is a great tip. I like that.
So what would be a calming tip or a calming
Well, deep breaths, right? Which really does calm you down. And somebody asked what the Superman pose was.
right.
It's just doing this, like where you're powerful, like Superman did, like that. But you'd be standing up, so you're like flying. So the key of it is you don't want to be like this. And women in particular tend to be more covered up. And what happens is when you take up more space, your body becomes more powerful to other people, but also in you.
If you're leaning into someone to try and show interest, is that seen as more threatening? Should you perhaps lay back?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it depends on how far in and what that person's norms are. But yeah, I would think in general, right, you're being more dominant. And so that's going to make them perhaps feel more intimidated.
So we do have a question that said, how do you know you're conversing with a troll from another country? Any signs are there so
I mean,
not to engage?
if you're talking to a troll from another country, I mean, there's a couple things. If you look at their profile and anything looks fishy, I mean, obviously, Russian Cyrillic letters, but that's an obvious thing, right? But also it's just created is more suspicious, doesn't have a lot of followers, isn't following anybody, and everyone's following them. Those are some things. Doesn't have a real face for the picture. I mean, obviously they can put any face, but at least they took effort to put a face, all those things. But in discoursing with them, trolls are there to disrupt people, right? That's the point of what they're doing. So they're not, if you're discussing something and trying to disabuse them of their misinformation, they're not going to spend any time with you because they're not going to win against you. So the only trolls because their job, they're being paid to dissuade people, and they're going to be like, oh, this person isn't stupid enough. I can't dissuade this person. So I would not worry too much about that. But trolls also, there's other types of trolls who are just in there to like be difficult, right? And stir things up. Those people you'll know right away. They'll just be this biggest jerk, and I would just walk away from them because they sort of fit the click away from them people. But you're right, it is, you do want to be careful, and there's no real fail-safe way for you to know.
Do you have any special advice for dealing with people spreading disinformation on Nextdoor? I don't know if you have that in California.
Yeah.
Or in Facebook community groups.
Yeah,
I notice it always goes to the rule of 5. By the 5th post, someone's insulting someone else. Is there a way to stop that pattern?
I think it's a hard problem. Nextdoor can be incredibly toxic. I think the biggest thing that works is sort of out of your hands, which is for the site itself to have automatic moderation, like the way Reddit does, where they have bots that moderate, and they're pretty good. Reddit is like a much nicer space than most places because of that. So those are some structural things. But you can't obviously do anything with those. I think the best advice is to just state the true thing without correcting the person, right? Because where people get upset is when they immediately get like, well, no, you're wrong. Whereas if you just do a new post, it's not in reply to them. It just says, this is what I understand from blah, blah, blah. And don't even seem like it can be in the same queue, but it's not like responding to somebody saying it. That can have better outcomes. I mean, people are still going to get upset. I mean, that's just the reality of life. But some of that will be diffused. Same thing with Facebook groups. I mean, obviously on Facebook groups, there is a way to notify the moderator of the group, but some groups, there's not a moderator there very frequently. So, you know, I would pick your battles. My own personal rule is, if I'm in a Facebook group and somebody says something that is so false and could harm people, you know, like sugar causes cancer or something like that, that's not true, I will step in and I'll say something. But if it's something that is, you know, less than that, I might not, because they're not going to believe it anyway.
It's going to become more and more with AI and with the campaigns heating up. We're going to see more and more disinformation.
I just can't even imagine. I'm scared to death, to be honest.
Who live in filter bubbles, you know, and so if we're wanting to protect our democracy and make sure people are making decisions based on accurate information, is your advice then that we just say, well, I read this on there and they seem to not agree with your source? Or is there some standard that we could say that you would suggest that we say?
Well, the problem is there isn't like, I don't even think I'd point out that it disagrees, because you're correcting them not for the original poster. You're correcting for the other people. The original poster is a lost cause. You're not going to persuade them. So there's no point in saying what you posted was wrong, or here's this true information that conflicts. You're posting it for all those other people who are still convertible or reachable, right? Who might read it and not know. And then they can be like, oh, okay, somebody else says this isn't true, so maybe I shouldn't read this original guy. But I mean, I hate to be pessimistic, but you're not going to change the original guy. The original guy believes what they believe. I mean, maybe you will, but it's pretty unlikely.
So the hope is that someone who's also following this stream will look into what you're posting as a different opinion or a different fact from the original poster, and it will raise some sort of questioning in them. Is that worthwhile?
Well, I mean, it's the way people use social media, right? When there's a fight, everybody reads all the comments. So it's a pretty good chance most people will read an opposing view and they'll pick up on that. but you won't seem like you're attacking them. Because like I said, the framework isn't to persuade. You're not trying to convince somebody. Because when you try to convince somebody, people just shut you down because they're just like, don't tell me what to think. Don't tell me what to do, right? All you're trying to do is give them that option of other information that's true and that they can be exposed to, so that, and you're right, it's not, I mean, you wish you could just hammer them over the head with it, like, hey, you idiots, this is a lie. And I wish that worked, because it would be so much more fun than what I'm suggesting. If we could just say, no, this is wrong. But the problem is, it doesn't actually work when you do that, as much as we try, and I try to.
Have you done any follow-up with your groups that you studied to see if they're having the same sort of feelings or if they've had any success?
We haven't done anything longitudinal, and that is the key question, because a lot of these interventions, right, we don't know how long they last, right? But on the flip side of it is the fact that something as simple as looking at a few Facebook memes could even change your opinions is pretty powerful. So it would be likely not that those effects would last forever, but that you're constantly exposed to that content. So what our recommendation in that was, like, that social media platforms should optimize their algorithms for content that's positive like that, because it will just lead to a better outcomes for them. But you're right, longitudinally, we don't really know.
So, well, we have time for one more question. Have you seen any shifts of regarding specific issues and people's perceptions when they have conversations or have had conversations?
Oh, you mean are some issues easier to shift people on than others?
Right, and to begin talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know of any study that looked at it specifically on issues. Although based on other literature, I mean, I think it's a fairly good, I mean, obviously people are more shiftable on things that they're less entrenched on, right? So often local issues people are more shiftable on than national politics, which oddly people are more invested in, even though the local matters more, but they know less about the local, right? They don't know what's going on in their town. So anything though that's, partisanship, they say, is a drug, and it really is, right? People will believe things even when they don't believe or even understand it, because their group does. So anything that's less partisan feeling is more shiftable, I think. So let me think of an example of that. Like,
So talking about your local school board versus this.
that's probably more shiftable, right? Because those often don't run on regular party lines, but even things, other topics, like topics that are, I mean, right now, everything is so partisan, because often the example, people might say, like, there's some people who are socially believe one thing and then fiscally something else. And so on social issues, they might be more shiftable and less shiftable on, I think that would stand to reason, right? There's also literature that shows people are more shiftable, say, on gay rights if they have a family member who is queer. So that's a shiftable issue based on context. But yeah, that's a really good question, and actually would be a really good study to test that.
Well, Gina, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you all of you who have attended tonight's meeting with us, and hope that you walk away with or leave with some good ideas, and we'll tackle a conversation that might have been too difficult or you were afraid to do so before. Please check our League of Women Voters of Illinois website, Mis and Disinformation page, for past recordings, and this recording will be posted in the next week or so. We do have future programs planned. Check the calendar, and we hope to see you again in August and September. Thank you so much, Gina.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.